Hey YouTube, it's Matteo here, and it is a hot one, but join me today. I've got the 2003 Infiniti G35 Sport up in the air, and I am fixing to take my first look underneath the car. I'm also going to do an oil change while I'm under here, just so I can set my baseline for maintenance. Under the car, I'm going to be looking for any sort of damage, any sort of signs of wear and tear, especially on suspension components. I'm going to be looking for leaks around the engine from hoses. I do anticipate some oil leaking under there, as the valve covers do appear to be leaking on either side of this engine. Let's take a look. I've got the car jacked up. We'll see what's going on. Join me. Overall, there's not a lot of bad to be had under here. Everything looks pretty good. Exhaust system is all original. I'm looking at the power steering rack. You can see we have a little bit of what appears to be power steering fluid leaking. I believe it's possibly leaking from the top of the rack where the steering shaft is located. So this power steering rack is on my radar at this point. This is something I'll have to keep an eye on. It might be something that needs to be replaced sooner rather than later. We do have some oil around the bell housing that could indicate the rear main seal is possibly leaking. It could also indicate the valve covers are leaking, and you can see oil dripping on the exhaust manifold, which that is most likely coming from the valve cover gaskets. Don't know if it's making the bigger mess, but I would say more than likely we have a probable rear main seal leak. That would be something I would plan to address when the clutch is being serviced. Not something I would immediately be concerned about. Not ideal, but not really a huge major concern. Moving to our suspension components. First thing I saw, we have the lower ball joint that is worn out and in need of replacement. That is pretty common on these cars, especially of this age and mileage. It's actually something I tackled on the 350Z, and I do have a video of that. So if you are interested, no need to wait for me to do it to this car. You can go check out that video. It's a real fun process there. Overall, the underside of the car looks reasonably clean, well maintained. One thing I check for on these cars is the W brace back there. You can see it's a little bit dinged up. That happens sometimes. These cars are kind of low to the ground. This one's actually in really good shape. The one off my Z was so bent up, I had to actually remove it. It was not in any way flat like this one. The transmission looks amazing. It's a CD01, so this is the early version of this transmission. They are known for having rough shifting issues in 5th and 6th gear. I really haven't driven the car enough in those gears yet to make an assessment on that. Visually, the transmission's in good shape. I don't see any signs of leaking from the output shaft. I was looking at the lower radiator hoses kind of under here, and at first glance, I'm not seeing anything concerning. The radiator hoses look like they're in good condition. You can see our little air dam is halfway present. It looks like this side was ripped off. That might have been due to catching it on a parking curb, something of that nature. Not a big deal, but it does kind of ruin the aesthetic of the car a little bit in my mind. It set the bar so high that when I see something like this, it's like, oh man, that kind of sucks, but whatever, not a big deal. So the tie rod ends are starting to show some signs of cracking. Here again, that's kind of a thing to watch out for in any car this old and this mileage. The tie rod ends are pretty easy to change out when you're doing the rest of the stuff. I'm looking at the bushings now and the control arms. There's a few different spots where we've got bushings. These are replaceable. They actually don't look terrible. And even this one back here on this rear control arm, I replaced all of the bushings on my 350Z. These bushings look like they still have some life on them, so I am not immediately concerned about getting those replaced. We've got our Brembo brakes, you can see right there. Brake pad, hard to kind of see, probably getting time to replace those pads. When I have the wheels off, I'll get a good look at the pad and we'll make an assessment of pad life. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and get a pan under here and we'll drain the oil. We'll see if there's any forbidden glitter in there. All right, here comes the choo-choo train. Let's see how this oil looks. It's probably clean and not in need of replacement. It looks rather healthy. There's nothing concerning me about the way this oil looks, and that makes me happy. So despite a couple little oil leaks we got, I think most of it's valve covers and probably rear main seal. I'm not really that concerned with the health of this engine. It looks like it was maintained as nicely as described by the seller. Very cool. I will wait for it to finish draining. It looks good. It does not look that old. I don't see any traces of metal. Good deal. I'm gonna check the oil cooler. There's a couple coolant lines that go into that. The oil pressure sending unit right next to it is another common spot for oil leaks, but I think we look pretty clean there. This car was definitely maintained very well, and I do appreciate anyone who does that, especially when I'm buying a vehicle from them. We'll let this thing finish draining. I'll get that oil filter out and we'll top it off with some fresh oil. So we've got this fancy Nismo cap. I've got my new oil filter on. It's time to fill it with fresh oil. However, with this cover on and this oil cap, I can't really get a good grip on it to unscrew it. So I figured we would take this nice engine dress-up cover off and take a look underneath at the upper intake manifold, see what's going on. Nothing too crazy. When I do the valve covers, there's a gasket between the upper intake manifold. It's actually in two halves, and there's a lower gasket as well that'll need to be replaced. So I'm gonna have to order those. The coil packs and the wire harness, all that stuff needs to get moved out of the way to do that. The variable cam timing solenoids for the intake cams, this engine only has that control on the intake side. There's a little metal gasket there. I'm going to replace those as well when I do the valve cover gaskets. Hopefully now I can get a grip on this. Yeah, it's tight. Let's get some channel locks on it. There we go. Excessively tight. I don't know if that's from the gasket or what. In any event, I have a spare OEM oil cap. I think I'm actually going to use it on this car just because everything else is pretty OEM. Should be easier to operate with this engine cover in place. All right, these VQs, they take about 5 quarts. So I'm gonna go ahead and get a funnel. All right, I do know now that this car is in my possession, I will be running Mobil 1, high mileage, full synthetic oil. Let's give it all I've got. All right, now that we've got our fresh oil in there, I'm gonna put in OEM style filler cap on there. Maybe next time we can get that off a little easier. And this Nismo one, I'll probably put that on my Z. I think that'll look good. Now that I'm completely sweaty and ready for a nice cold adult beverage, let's wrap this video up. Thank you all for watching. As you saw, we had a peek underneath the bottom of this car. And overall, it matches what we see on top. A rather well-maintained example of a G35. Here again, it was kept clean, and from what I could tell, pretty much unmodified. Little bit of damage under there, air dam, whatever. I will probably finish removing it at this point. I'm not worried about putting that back. And we do have some wear and tear items. Looks like we have a rear main seal leaking. Of course, we confirmed the valve covers are leaking. That's not really shocking news. I have a power steering leak, possibly from the rack. I'll have to keep an eye on that. And we have some suspension components, lower ball joints. I think that needs to be on the map first for replacement, but I'm also gonna keep an eye on the tie rod ends. I'll probably end up replacing all of that stuff at the same time. The actual suspension bushings look okay for now. As I drive the car, especially when I put it into daily driving service, I'll have a better idea of how the steering feels. I know when I did all of those components on my Z, it really tightened up the handling of my car. So I would not be opposed to replacing the bushings and all that stuff while I'm doing the things that actually need to be replaced, just to maybe give a nice brand new suspension feeling to this vehicle. I'll also, as I drive it, I'll get a good feel for how the shocks and the springs are. Despite not wanting to modify this car, I can't help but envision it with like a 1-inch suspension lowering setup. It would look pretty cool. But that being said, as a daily driver, I'm not going to do anything crazy with it. And for now, the suspension is going to remain where it's at stock ride height. So thank you all for joining me on the horizon. And I think next video, we're going to go ahead and diagnose this cooling fan issue. The car overheats at idle. The cooling fans are not running. What's going on with that? Stay tuned. Thank you all for watching. Like, subscribe, and Matty O is going to move on with his day. See you next time.